Thank you so much. It is my great pleasure to welcome you all. I'm Grzegorz Ekiert. I'm Director of Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies and Professor of Government. Thank you for braving the weather. I think the all Russia events should be held with the weather like this. So this is a very special event. This is inaugural event of a series of lectures and conversations with most prominent experts and academics, which are co-sponsored and co-organized by Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Minda de Gonzburg Center for European Studies, and Ukrainian Research Institute. Now, this is a first step in building closer relationship and cooperation among Harvard centers which focus on broadly defined Europe. Our next guest in March, so a few weeks away, will be Anne Applebaum. So I'm just mentioning this to get your appetite for the next event. Now, the theme of this academic year is war in Europe and Russian aggression on Ukraine. Just to remind you, today is 1,384th day of the most devastating war in Europe since 1945. The war of aggression started by Putin has no end in sight, and we all watch with alarm the Trump administration siding with aggressors and attacking Europe. Now, we'll have the opportunity to discuss the situation and ramification of the war with Fiona Hill, who is the eminent expert on Russia and foreign policy advisor. Fiona is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington and chancellor of Durham University. She was for many years an intelligence analyst specializing in Russian and European affairs. And she served as the deputy assistant to the president and senior director for European and Russian affairs in the first President Trump's National Security Council. As many of you remember, she was the witness in the November 2019 hearings in the House regarding the impeachment inquiry of Donald Trump. During the first Trump administration, she was one of the adults in the room. And as a revenge, she was just stripped of her security clearance last March by the Trump administration. Now, Fiona graduated from University of St. Andrew and then continued her education at Harvard, where she earned MA degree in the MA program at the Davis Center, and then PhD in history in the history department. Fiona published widely, and her recent book called There Is Nothing for You Here became a national bestseller. She has been a great supporter of Harvard and of Davis Center. Now, the conversation with Fiona will be moderated by Steve Solnick. Steve is the executive director of the Davis Center and accomplished scholar of Russian politics. Steve holds PhD from Harvard Government Department. Before returning to Harvard and to the Davis Center, Steve served for a decade on the Faculty of Political Science at Columbia University. He was the head of the Ford Foundation offices in Russia and in India, and was a leader of a number of educational institutions. Before I turn the floor to Steve and Fiona, I would like to thank the staff of all three centers, and especially Chris Martin for coordinating that event. So Steve, Fiona, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Grzegorz. Thank you all for braving the cold tonight and for being here. Fiona, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Steve.
You are also here for the Board of Overseers meeting at Harvard, so I'm going to put it to a vote to the audience. Would you rather hear what's going on at Harvard? Or we'll stick with things you can talk about, maybe. I want to talk about, of course, I want to spend some time talking about the war in Europe, but before we do, in your memoir, you say that your early life laid the path for everything that followed. And so I want to spend a couple of minutes sort of making that connection. You and I have something in common. We're both first-generation college students. And that's a big theme in your memoir. Do you think that made you a better storyteller? And do you think it made you a better analyst when you really got to your professional life?
Well, thanks very much, Steve. I think actually both of those points that you made about storytelling, because you have to always set off and tell your own story, right? I mean, all of us here are trying to tell a story for ourselves about what we're doing in the world and what the world is doing and trying to make sense of it all. And we all bring a certain perspective to it. I mean, looking around this room here, I bet everyone's got a very different view on what's happening on the ground in Russia and Ukraine. But you've also got a different view about your own life and the course it's on than perhaps a sibling might have. Coming even from the same family, but kind of going off on a different path. I often have an argument with my sister about events, sort of early, kind of historical debates about what really happened, kind of at that particular time,
at
way
dinner.
Back
what
then.
Really happened at dinner?
Who really said what,
Yeah.
The analysis of the situation, and she's taken away something completely different from that, or has a different memory. So that's, something I learned early on. And in terms of the analysis, it's also, if you're a kind of perpetual outsider in this situation, you ask a lot of different questions than if you might, take something for granted. And I mean, I look around this room here, and there's actually a lot of people I know in this room, and I just want to say hi to everyone. I haven't seen Mark Kramer for an extraordinarily long period of time. He was here back in the day, opening up the Cold War archive, and I was thinking about all the material that you've discovered over time that gives different analysis and different perspectives on issues that we all thought that we knew and that we didn't know. You were a postdoc when I was here at the what was then the Russian Research Center, before it was even the Davis Center. Grzegorz and I were tutors together at Cabot House, and I took Grzegorz first class at Harvard, which he was experimenting on all of us, and it was super fascinating because I've never forgotten it, because he was looking at how, as somebody who was originally from Poland, how interesting it was for all of us to hear as well about how Poland, after the end of the whole communist period, had reverted back to earlier political patterns. And that, seemed actually quite astounding. And, you were asking all these questions for yourself about how did that happen and, how would these historical patterns played out over time. I see Melissa Carr, who was at the back, who was looking away at that moment, who we worked together down at the Kennedy School on lots of projects that we worked with Graham Allison, who I've just seen today, who's the reason I was late, asking, kind of questions about what are we missing, what are we not understanding. And I think because I'd set out as a kid with so many questions I had no answers to, and there's somebody I'm seeing up at the top here, Kieran McCormick, who's over from the Kennedy School. He's from my hometown in Bishop Auckland. And Kieran and I were swapping stories of generations later. Did it get worse? Did it get better? I mean, he lived just before a bus stop that I used to get off and on all the time. So we were talking about the number 6 bus, and whether the bus stop has changed ever since I was a kid. It hasn't. It's still a concrete slab, like Russian bus stops in the middle of nowhere, freezing cold, pitch black, this kind of thing.
So that prepared you.
Yeah, that prepared you.
Yeah.
So it's just a whole about what's your starting point, how you ask questions. And I think, as we're going to move into this, big discussion about what's happening, I think all of us, it's worth bearing in mind that we're all telling ourselves a story about what's happening, and we have to be constantly addressing that. And Vladimir Putin had a story that he thought he was responding to, and a story that he had in his mind that was very different from the story of the people that the Russian soldiers encountered when they got... I keep thinking about those very early stages of that war, when people just couldn't get their heads around what was happening. And certainly Ukrainians, including a Ukrainian friend who I was at Harvard with, just could not imagine that actually Russia would invade. And then the kind of question there, about Russians, what are you doing? Why are you here? Do you remember in those very first pictures, there'd be people standing on the sides of the road going, what are you doing here? And Russian soldiers were like, I don't know, we thought we were on an exercise. So this is all about stories and analysis and, the kind of the perspective that you have on what's happening.
So before we get to really about Ukraine, one more about your journey and the perspective that you bring. So the full-scale invasion was 22, but Russia and Ukraine had been at war for years already, and were at war when you moved from being basically a scholar to a policymaker in the government. When you entered government service, was there some perspective that you gained that you had lacked as a scholar? Often the question's the other way around: what do scholars bring to policymaking?
Yeah.
I'm wondering, was there some like new window that opened to you where you thought, oh, now I understand something that I didn't understand when I was writing these great scholarly books about Siberia at Brookings?
Siberia, yeah.
It's my favorite of your books, by the way.
Well, I had 2 stints in government. The first was a national intelligence officer, which frankly was like being at the Davis Centre, but taking it up a notch. Now everyone's going to go, what? But it's just the analysis, because you're asked to ask a question. It was almost like having to do a permanent term paper, kind of with a kind of a question, an essay question, going away and trying to analyse something. And we weren't necessarily always thinking about the policy implications of that, because that wasn't that role. So it was a very familiar role for anybody who's at Harvard. We were asked to, analyse what's happening, why these patterns reverting, what are the things that people should be thinking about. There's a colleague over here who's been in those roles here, Maureen, who's sitting nodding along here. But, I mean, it's an analytical job. It's not that surprising for anybody coming from this kind of environment. The thing that I learned the most was all these government acronyms. I had no idea what people were talking about half the time, because they'd all talk in acronyms. And it was just, I sat in one whole entire meeting thinking I knew what the meeting was about, and realising after I'd gone out that I had no clue what the meeting was about at all, because I got the acronym wrong. And so I was like totally and utterly absurd. And it's just, just to give an example, when the Biden administration created the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, if you're a British person, that has a totally different meaning. So you could have a really weird, kind of conversation for a very long period of time about the IRA. And
so you had to be for the IRA for a while.
I had no idea what, tax breaks and all that has got to do with anything. So just to put that, so that was more, it was a sort of a mystification of the process of analysis. But you were just kind of preparing a similar, if you went to somewhere like the Kennedy School or anywhere else, you were prepared to write those kinds of memos, answering the kinds of, questions. When I got into the policy world, that questions were really quite different. And I had, in the first time around, got crosswise with Dick Cheney's office quite a few times. And my one and only picture of my time in the first time in the National Intelligence Council from the Bush administration, because I worked from the transition from George W. Bush to Barack Obama in the first year of Obama, was a picture of Dick Cheney legging it out the door, like, exit stage left, pursued by a bear, where he and had taken on my colleague and I, because at the time, it's ironic, it was about Ukraine. So it was a deep dive, and it's described in Angela Stent's book, so I'm not giving anyone here, private information here. It's been described in a number of public commentaries now. It was ahead of the meeting in Bucharest for the now infamous debate about whether Ukraine should get a membership action plan of NATO in 2008. And we'd been charged with all of, when you're a national intelligence analyst, you have to be a catastrophist. It's like about what everything could go wrong. You're not just looking about what everything could go right. You're supposed to actually be talking about what could go wrong. When you're a policymaker, you want everything to go right for your policy. So often you're telling people, something that they really don't want to hear. And, they might say, well, God, you're exaggerating that, aren't you? Or on what basis? But we've been doing quite a bit of polling, and lots of analysis and a lot of discussions with European counterparts about whether they were likely to be really supportive of Ukraine getting a membership action plan in Bucharest. And, there'll be no surprise to anyone here. There were a lot of countries that were not keen on the idea for the reason that they assumed that this would be a blow-up and that this would be, causing some, problems down the line. And Bill Burns has written about this, in his book as well, from that time frame, because he was in Moscow as the ambassador. But there were countries that were quite gung-ho, and there were the Baltic states and, Poland and, a couple of others at the time. And then the British, being British, were like, and they were just trying to find a kind of a way of fudging it all and saying yes to everybody and, trying to sort of smooth things over, but not committing in that classic, kind of, as I could know, British fashion. And anyway, we presented all of this to President Bush, because it was sort of a deep dive. So it was like the worst possible tutorial, experience. We were getting grilled, Socratic method, being like in the law school, and they're constantly asking, backwards and forwards questions. And Bush was kind of enjoying the whole thing, and he was sort of sitting back in his chair. He was chewing a cigar, so it was a bit weird, It was a kind of like this sort of he was a very curious and very warm and funny guy. But he was leaning back, chewing a cigar, and then chugging Diet Pepsi on the other hand, and then asking us all these questions. And then Cheney's leaning, looking, kind of slightly like this at us. And he's looking at his briefing.
Not a warm and fuzzy guy.
It wasn't warm and fuzzy at that moment. And he basically says, so what you're telling me is you're opposed to freedom and democracy. And I looked at my counterpart and went, trying to keep the poker face. I thought, did we say that? Which obviously we were, but that's the policy, because he was at that point, he was going out making these big speeches about freedom and democracy and, bringing Ukraine into a membership action plan for NATO. It was all about policy. This is all a period when things were not going well on the ground in Afghanistan and elsewhere. There was the freedom agenda. This is around the time that later on, of course, things go awry in Georgia. There's the visit to Georgia, all the big speeches, there's a Vilnius speech. You've got to imagine there's all these things are going on that now historic events. And the Cheney group, the Vice President's office, were really pushing this kind of policy to, embrace this whole issue. And he was assessing, that somewhere down the line, Russia might want to, go after Ukraine. So he would have said, told you so, in February of, 2022. We thought we should kind of get ahead of it with a membership action plan. But what we were trying to say is, look, not all the allies are on board here. And this is going to become complicated because, NATO is a collective defense organization, and you need to have solidarity. It comes back to where we are now, right? If you don't have the full support of all your allies, it's going to be, quite difficult. And we were charting out all the reasons that various countries were opposed to this. So, you always think about when somebody throws to you, so you're not in favour of freedom and democracy, you don't repeat the question back again, right? So we were trying to say something that we weren't taking that on to suggest that we're, opposed to freedom and democracy, but to say, well, sir, no, we were saying, and he just slammed the briefing book up and walked out the door.
Oh.
And I thought, that didn't go well.
No.
And then Bush said to us, nah, don't worry, old iron ass is just yanking your chain. And then we went, oh, and didn't know how to respond. So anyway, that's a very different, sort of experience. But it was the first realization before they went on to the policy thing that you've got very different reasons you're asking questions, reasons for telling stories differently, depending on what position you're in. And doing a policy-making position is very different from just analysing a situation, because people are asking questions for different kinds of purposes, not answering. You're not supposed to be asking an exam question that seems very clear. They're trying to figure out what to do with that information.
So listening to you talking about Bill Burns and Dick Cheney and George Bush, I was struck with this odd wave of almost nostalgia, really. Because we have a very, very different team in place now. And so by way of sort of bringing us to the present and to NATO and the war in Ukraine, we are in the midst of, or someone is, in the midst of negotiations about the future of Ukraine that may or may not involve Ukraine in those negotiations. The team that the Trump administration has doing this is idiosyncratic from the perspective of a team that would be negotiating a ceasefire at the end of a war. My question is, are they doing anything right?
Well, they're asking hard questions and asking about, well, why has it failed so far? And if it failed, maybe it wasn't the right people. So I think that's kind of, if you look at what J.D. Vance said quite recently in one of his, I think it was maybe an X equivalent of, do we still call them tweets?
I don't know.
X's,
Truths, I think. Tweets,
basically,
truths, yeah.
He's saying that, maybe this conflict is going to be resolved by smart people who live in the real world. So the assumption is that none of us live in the real world, just to be clear. Even if, catching the number 6 bus to Bishop Auckland, it felt pretty real, back in the day. But there's just this whole idea that, people like us who are all, in here, so by guilt by association of all you come into this Harvard auditorium, we live in an ivory tower, we don't have, we have the wrong information or the wrong approach to all this. We know too much about the history. This is all just about making a deal between people. So, somebody like Jared Kushner, and I've heard him say it, and he's probably been quoted somewhere saying it's not the issues that are hard, it's the people and getting, the people to an agreement. Well, I would also say, back to the beginning of your set of questions, you've got to know where a person is coming from and about their background and how they think to be able to then even to make a deal. I mean, if you just suddenly started, if you don't know the person next to you and started to talk, to them, do you assume that they would think just like you do? Do they bring to the table or bring to the conversation the same knowledge, the same context, the same analysis of the issue? Vladimir Putin always starts with his 1,000-year version of history, which isn't the version of history that you would I would have heard of from Ned Keenan, or that I would have done with Pipes, or the Jeggers would have given us as a poll, if he'd done a potted course on Polish history or views of Russia 101. So this is making some assumptions that all issues are fairly straightforward, and in this case, this is a transaction, a deal. And it's about concrete issues related to human nature, or in this case, something that more approximates, which is the approach, a real estate deal. And I'm not actually diminishing that either, because if you think about, many of these issues, if we look about them historically, a lot of the crowned heads of Europe and, dynasties and, many famous foreign envoys of kings and queens have approached things in the same way. It's been trading of real estate, trading of dowries, marrying off, different members of your family to others to, resolve issues of state. So, it's not totally unfamiliar to any of us.
It's clearly where Trump is coming from, where Witkoff is coming from. They are real estate deal people. Andrew Rifkin in The Atlantic, in a current article, says that it is wrong to think about deals with Putin, that he just doesn't, that is not where he comes from. Where he comes from is the courtyard, the dvor, where you don't make a deal. And so there's this fundamental mismatch of frames.
Although you do make a deal in the dvor, if you acquiesce to what I'm saying to you, I'll stop hitting you.
But is that
That's a deal that was in my playground at school as well. I'll come over and hit you, and if you, do what I say or don't do what I don't like, I'll stop hitting you.
So is there any incentive then for Putin to stop hitting Ukraine?
Not right now.
So where then, if you were in government and you're advising this this real estate team that's meeting in Miami, what's your advice to get to some kind of, better place?
Well, the problem that we have, let's just say once and for all also, is that we have, can you even get in the door to give people advice? Mm-hmm. Because part of the problem that we're dealing with, and I think we're seeing this in the structure also of these discussions, which, are there negotiations at this point? There are efforts to make a deal, is that it's the people that they think ought to be involved in this. So all of the newspaper articles are juxtaposing Steve Witkoff with Kirill Dmitriev, who was a classmate of some people here, here at Harvard back in the day. And is Kirill Dmitriev, a direct counterpart of Witkoff? He actually isn't. Witkoff is literally an avatar, an envoy of Trump. He probably does really know how Trump thinks. They play golf, they hang out in Mar-a-Lago. They've known each other in the New York circles for a long time. So who can talk to Witkoff? There's another issue. And how would you explain to Witkoff in this larger, context, the context that you're coming from? So even beyond what you would tell them, would they understand or even care about what you're telling them? And would they listen? So there's a messenger problem. So Kirill Dmitriev has sort of self-selected in part for this. His daughter and Putin's daughter are friends. I said Trump's daughter there, but a lot of these things are here. People are friends with all of these, different family members and connections. And they all believe that you have to know someone and be connected with them in different ways to be able to make any headway. And that's so we've got a real kind of mismatch here, because on the European side, we've got Alexander Stubb, who's taken up his golf clubs and, gone off to play, golf with the president. But most of the other European leaders, they just don't, they're not in those circles. I mean, they're all kind of, elected officials, from boring sort of backgrounds, kind of who don't have those, thank God, those family connections, because that's not what they voted in for. So actually the US and Russia in a strange way are more matched together in terms of listening to each other and being a kind of a circle of a circular side of commentary, seeing the world in similar ways of deal making, and not really interested in listening to anyone else from the outside. We're all discounted because we're just the chattering class or the failed analysts and failed diplomats who've not made any success in all of this. And the Europeans are just not in the game. They're just in a kind of a different circle altogether. Because what would be, you would think would be obvious if you understood, the kind of context, which I know, most people here do, where you'd realise that you've got to really be sticking together here, having a clear plan, and not showing any real daylight. When you're dealing with Putin, you certainly don't pander to Putin. You don't put your cards on the table, right away and telling about all the things that you're willing to give up. I mean, Trump has already, on behalf of Ukraine, without being asked to, pretty much said you can have Crimea, you can now have all Donbass. There's all these rumors, going around all the time. And, kind of, we'll freeze the lines in Kherson and Zaporizhia.
We'll keep NATO out.
We'll keep NATO out, right. In fact, we're not even in NATO anymore because we're telling the Europeans that by 2027, they're going to have to fund NATO. I don't think Canada might be in NATO either. I keep wondering, is Canada in NATO? Under this kind of depiction, because they're in the Western Hemisphere. So looking at the national security strategy, then no, they can't be either, because they're part of the Western Hemisphere.
They're in NATO, but they're a vassal state of the United States.
But that means that might mean that they're not. If they're not in Europe, right? So there's all this confusion in there, which again suggests to Putin that there's so much dissonance here. There's so much noise. There's so many gaps. That why would you, kind of listen and hear what anybody else has to say, and why would you do anything different at this particular point? So, and you will not be able to get that across because you are not somebody that they will listen to. We used to actually ask counterparts. So the briefing before Helsinki, forget the press conference, but if you think about the meeting beforehand, it was the president of Finland who did the briefing, essentially, for President Trump about what President Putin was like. Because there was no way that President Trump would think that any of us might know what he was like. Why would we? We're not Putin's counterparts. But the president of Finland at the time, Sauli Niinistö, had met with Putin at that point probably more than anyone else had, just by proximity and the frequency of meetings. So we kind of asked his staff, would he be willing to just, instead of talking about Finnish-US bilateral issues, there were issues, I'm not trying to belittle, there were issues on the table, but would he be willing to talk about what it's actually like?
Someone from Finland just walked out in the back
row.
Oh, no. Very offended at that.
Yeah, offended that, yes. To sit down and talk about what it was actually like talking to Putin and negotiating with Putin and, basically what he was likely to say or how he was likely to act.
So on the daylight, right, if the prime directive then for dealing with Putin is unity, then let me ask you something. I was in a meeting within the last week, some people involving NATO, who made it very clear that as far as the Europeans are concerned, they're in a state of active war with Russia. That describes the situation, that NATO has got to get itself into a state of mind of war. The United States, not just in the national security strategy, which very clearly does not portray us as being at war with Russia. If anything, we're at war with certain liberal parties in Europe, according to the national security strategy. But also in the minds of, I think, most Americans, we're not at war with Russia. Where do you come down on that? Who's at war with Russia right now? Is the United States effectively at war with Russia? Should we consider ourselves to be at war with
Trump's
Russia?
just basically said no. Look, there was an issue.
Let me put it differently. Is Russia at war with us?
Well, that is another question.
Yeah.
So is the United States at war with Russia? I would say no at this particular point. But is Russia at war with us? Yes, probably still. Because in terms of information, and different levels of, we're getting hacked all the time, guys. I mean, I just got an email just before I came in here. Probably don't call me anyone. That one of my colleagues has been utterly hacked by the Russians because, it's actually, you can't find out that. And that my phone is probably now compromised too. And I was like, yeah, shit, I was planning to call my mum. I better not do that now. But that'll be boring, for them to listen to. But, but this is all this. We're constantly under attack and assault. The information war, the propaganda. I can, when people often ask me questions about, kind of the war, it's framed often in things that I've just seen Vladimir Putin speak about, because it's all out there. We're all living. We're all the time swirling around, kind of in a big kind of pool of, information, disinformation, and, propaganda that's coming from Russia and China and other places as well. But, Putin is so effective. He's a very effective miscommunicator, if we kind of want to put it that way. He's been at it a long time, 25 years. There's a great tradition that, he comes out of from the Bolshevik, the Soviet, period all the way through. We can ask ourselves a question of whether the United States should have been at war, kind of with Russia in a propaganda and information war. And, I would like to say that, when I was here at the Russian Research Center, back in the day, God, we thought, no, there's absolutely no way that we'd end up in this situation. If I think back about when I enrolled here at Harvard in 1989, I was taking a class with Stanley Hoffman. Some of you might have been in that very class when he came in and said, ladies and gentlemen, the wall has fallen. And we all thought that this was, I spent, 10 years down working with Graham Allison at the Kennedy School, strengthening democratic institutions with a lot of other people here. I don't think Mark, Kramer thought the Cold War would be back, when you're doing the archive of the Cold War. We thought we were, in a totally different frame here. And it's always hard, to think that we've got into that kind of mindset. But Putin absolutely, was thinking that he was at war and conflict with the United States, with the West, the collective West, which he really thought was the United States. For anybody who was paying attention, following his speeches, or having, like I did, the opportunity to sit, next to him and listen to what he's saying, it's crystal clear. Because his view was that once the Soviet Union had pulled out of Europe, the United States should have pulled out too, because they were both occupying forces of Europe, and that NATO was just the corollary of the Warsaw Treaty Organization. It wasn't a collective defense mechanism. It was just a whole bunch of militaries under proxies, exactly under the command of the US. Why was it the SACEUR was always American? Why is SACEUR still, kind of an American? He did not see that this was the voluntary contributions of all of the other European countries. And frankly, even for some of the rest of us, it might be hard to see that because there was so much resistance, even on the part of Europeans to do, much for defence after 1989. So I worked last year with the UK government at Strategic Defence Review and looked at all of the, the way that defence spending went down really dramatically. After 1989, welfare spending went up. The National Health Service in the UK takes up something like about 9% now of the UK budget. That was, defence used to be at that kind of level before. The UK is spending not yet 3%, which was kind of part of the promise, and that's in its way after transportation, education. It's like every other, European country, and actually the United States as well, debt, servicing, pensions, benefits, all these other kinds of things. And that's kind of what people were basically expecting. We were not thinking that we were going to be in this kind of situation. And every single European country was relying on the United States for its security. Let's be honest about it. And so if you're Vladimir Putin, you're sitting there, you're thinking, well, okay, we just need to get the US to pull out. And Trump's thinking the same thing, why are we paying for all these ne'er-do-well, kind of Europeans all the time? Because in the first Trump administration, I was actually asked by a very senior German official, what was going on in the US? Why was Trump, talking about pulling troops out of Germany and, kind of spending less on European security? He said the US made a strategic decision to pay for European security. I was like, I don't think that's actually the case. And I was thinking, well, I'm not an expert actually on, American history, although I should have been, but I was going back suddenly reading, books back to Kennedy and Johnson, trying to kind of like figure out after this. I refuted the question, but I thought, did I miss something? And they were basically saying that we'd made a decision not to pay for universal health care, but that's obviously patently not true, but to pay more for security after World War II. Would every American think that we'd, kind of made that kind of trade-off? But that was what, senior officials, and they were saying, so why is the US suddenly changing its mind? So that gets into the kind of, the problem that we have here, that Putin is not so far off in thinking that the United States was still, in a way, kind of like a post-World War II occupying force because it's still paying for European security. And so in December of 2021, we're almost in the kind of anniversary of, that period now, the Europeans sent that démarche. The Russians sent that démarche to Europe and to the United States, basically saying, we want to pull back of NATO back to pre-1997 borders, and this idea that the US should, kind of move on out. And so we're in that weird situation now where both the US wants to pull out, and President Trump and Putin wants the US to pull out, and Europeans are suddenly, and it is actually a fact that now the US may not be at war with Russia. Russia may still have, with Putin, different ideas, but Europe is most definitely in a conflict with Russia over the future configuration of Europe in every context of that, or in every sense of that, from borders to, kind of the political arrangements, to security, to economics, you name it.
And so just one more thing on this, and then I want to get back to Ukraine, and fear not, in about 10 minutes, I'm going to go to the audience because I'm sure a lot of you have questions. If the United States effectively pulls out of NATO, and arguably the Article 5 guarantee, it may not be worth the paper that it's written on even now. Does NATO continue to exist? Does it play a role, or does it become just redundant to the EU in a certain way?
Well, look, in the NSS, the National Security Strategy, which you can all read, it's very short, by the way.
Lively.
It actually
short and lively.
Yeah. It calls out that very discrepancy between the EU and the NATO. And Trump wants to see the EU gone. I mean, that's what he says. I mean, he said it so many times. I mean, I can repeat many times the things that he said. The EU is worse than China, and all the rest of it. But it gets down to this difference about what I was just saying about security. Because Trump's view was that NATO was created to keep Europe secure so that there could be mutual economic benefit and prosperity. So he would have been among those American thinkers and others who were always opposed to the EU from the start, that this is an idea that it made Europe more competitive. I mean, it obviously helped European, kind of prosperity from the 70s onwards. I mean, even for the UK, I mean, people in the UK forgot what UK looked like in the 70s, when they kind of left. Well, now they're back to the 70s again, so enjoying it. But the whole point was it was meant to put Europe on a more solid economic footing. And so what Trump is saying, why should we keep them paying for European security if Europe's going to compete with us? At least with China, we don't pay anything for their security and they compete with us. So that's how, in his view, the European Union is worse than China and European countries. And he's actually thrown down a gauntlet in the national security strategy saying, you guys had better figure out, which is more important for you, the EU or NATO, while Europeans would say both. And of course, with Sweden and Finland, well, some Europeans would say both. Not every European would say both, would they? But Sweden and Finland, in joining NATO from having not been in NATO, the more countries that are in both, the question is, and that's what's being posed there, what is the difference? But Trump has made it very clear that he now sees NATO, absent the nuclear guarantee, and that's where Article 5 might get, kind of a question. Is it the nuclear guarantee? Is it the nuclear umbrella? What's the future of nuclear deterrence? These are all big questions that some people here, as students could write papers about, because we're all trying to figure it out right now. Is that he sees NATO as a European enterprise. And if you think about the 28-point plan, if any of you, have read that, there was a slightly surreal element, but it gets picked up again in the national security strategy of the United States mediating between NATO and Russia about Ukraine, which suggests that the United States isn't in NATO.
Not in NATO.
And then it's picked up in the national security strategy about mediating with Europe, over, and Russia, mediating between Europe and Russia. So, I mean, this is for all of us who have been writing about continuity and change in foreign policy, a big discontinuity here. Yeah, but it's not a discontinuity for Trump. Trump 1.0, all of that was evident. It was just masked behind, kind of all of the veneer of, the sort of continuation of the Dick Cheney or, George W. Bush or other, kind of more traditional kind of Republican foreign policy. But it was always there from the very beginning. He didn't think that the United States should be footing the bill for Europe. Barack Obama didn't think that the United States should be footing the bill for Europe. But he now wants to go much further. And Kennedy did, right?
Yeah. Yes, I actually thought in that strategy, the Trump administration talks about NATO the way Margaret Thatcher used to talk about Europe.
Yeah,
I'm going to Europe.
Like, Europe.
I want to get back to Ukraine just for one moment. Gabrielis Landsbergis was here 4 or 6 weeks or so ago, and he said very clearly, he was adamant, the war in Ukraine will be decided on the battlefield. Do you agree with that?
Well, there are multiple battlefields, so I guess, did you ask him which one?
No.
Oh, I see.
It was an artful
yes,
man.
Because I mean there is the physical battlefield, the trenches.
He meant the trenches.
Yeah, I'm sure he said that. Yeah, and meant that. But if you actually think, I mean, all of us who are historians about all of the different wars, they get settled in multiple different places at a time because there's the issue of political will, right? The will to continue to fight. And if we think about World War I, you know, I mean, Germany kind of imploded in all kinds of, it didn't do well on the battlefield, but there was a kind of an implosion at home. But Russia left the battlefield in World War I, or rather Russian soldiers left the battlefield in World War I. I remember getting tested about that by Richard Pipes and getting all my battles muddled up. And at one point he said, "You've lost a whole contingent of Russian soldiers in the Pripyat marshes, Miss Hill. Are you going to be able to get them back?" And I said, "No, I think they're lost forever, Professor Pipes," because I couldn't remember where they went. So anyway, all I'm just saying, he's not here anymore, but just don't take World War I battle maneuvers. It's too complicated. And I got lost with them. But the whole point is that they got lost and they didn't want to fight the war anymore. Yeah. And, you know, we all know, you know, kind of basically what happens here. And so there's those battlefields for hearts and minds at home, you know, the ability to continue a war. Putin is fighting a war with mercenary force, essentially, because he's paying for all the soldiers. So those payments are there. I mean, nobody was getting paid in the Imperial Army. You were just, you know, conscripted there in 25 years before you could, you know, get out. Nobody was getting paid. You were kind of lost to your family, who were often, you know, beggared as a result of your departure. And, you know, the Ukrainians are getting paid as well, but they're also, you know, fighting for their lives, their livelihoods, their existence, their futures. But it's not the same, you know, kind of contract. So the kind of question is the financial aspects of this, the economic, you know, kind of larger context, whether there's still the will to fight, and then there's the will to support. So there's that political information kind of battlefield. I think it's being fought on all of those at the same time. So yes, Ukraine is losing ground on the battlefield, but if they've lost the support of the United States and they haven't got then, you know, the support, even the political support, the moral support, you know, the kind of the determination on the part of European and other partners to say, you know, we're kind of with you, you know, here. No matter how it turns out, then, you know, they're kind of losing in that realm as well. I don't think they have lost yet in that realm. The will to fight is definitely still there, but it's the resources. It's not just the manpower. It's the, you know, the weapon systems. It's the finances. And basically, once somebody else tells you you've lost, which is kind of basically what Putin's telling the Ukrainians, and now Trump is telling the Ukrainians, it's very hard to keep saying, no, you know, we can still persist. Because winning, you know, for lots of Americans has a very clear, I mean, think about Trump, you know, won. Remember Scaramucci, and we're winning, is everybody ready to win today? And then he was out, you know, kind of within a few days. Yeah, exactly. We do talk in the United States a lot about winning. Having come originally from the UK, I don't always think like that. A win is sometimes getting the bus. Or it's like, if you think about soccer rather than American football, it's
the bus was clearly a traumatic experience.
Well, it was because we talked about, because if you grow up without a car and you've got to take the bus and the bus doesn't come, you're kind of in a bit of a problem. And that's kind of the way for Ukraine. I mean, it's to sort of think about, they're already in a very difficult environment. Sometimes a win is just making it through a day. A win is making sure that Pokrovsk hasn't fallen. Or, you know, it's not something about winning back, you know, something. It's not getting that try or the field goal or, you know, moving, you know, down the yards. I mean, American football is infuriating for anybody coming from a more of a soccer background or cricket where nothing happens. Sorry, cricket fans everywhere. But it's just, you know, kind of, cricket matches can go on for years.
Went out the door right after Finland there.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, cricket matches can go on for years. Rain stops play, all kinds of things, you know, kind of happen.
What else do you have to do? You're just waiting for the bus anyway.
But it's that whole idea of that, about, you know, kind of, we need to be thinking about this in a different sense, because, look, even if Ukraine capitulated to what Trump and Putin are demanding, is this over?
Well,
I think not, right?
That gets to the question of the security guarantee that
Exactly.
Europe could provide. So let me then ask about that, and then one more question, and then I'm going to go to the audience. Is there a credible security guarantee that NATO, the United States, European Union, a coalition of the willing, whatever, could provide that would actually be credible and be part of a negotiated, I don't want to say deal, I hate the word already, ceasefire, you know?
I think there's lots of different examples that we could look at that would tell us, you know, what might be necessary, even if something might not be feasible. Japan and Russia are still at war, technically, right?
Over the Kuril Islands.
Yeah, well, 1956, they didn't sign the peace treaty. The United States and Japan signed a peace treaty in San Francisco. The Soviet Union and Japan did not. And they still haven't. They were supposed to sign one in 2000. In fact, I was part of a group here at Harvard where we worked with the Japanese and Russian governments to try to kind of move towards, this was in the 1990s, towards a peace treaty, and we never achieved it. But there's not much, I mean, there's chances now of Japan probably being in conflict with China, but it'd be inconceivable to think, we should never say that, of course, because maybe something will happen, but that Japan and Russia would end up, you know, playing out the Russo-Japanese war again. And part of that was, you know, because it just sort of moved into a different direction, but also it's because the United States continued to have bases in Japan, for one thing. And Japan, you know, kind of went on to be a very prosperous, you know, country where everybody recognized its sovereignty and independence, and it was kind of built up and reconstructed and brought, you know, kind of back into the whole fold. So there's a model. They still don't have a peace treaty. And the Japanese still have claims over
But
Kuril
even without it...
I was just going to say, and then there's Finland,
Yeah.
you know, which is another great example. Finland did not demilitarize. Finland can still, you know, kind of bring up all of its reserves. Maybe the Finnish guy walked out and come back in again. You know, it's basically...
watching a cricket match.
I mean, yes, they agreed not to basically try to take the territory back by force, but they were always there where the Russians or the Soviets, you know, before that assessed that, yes, of course, they could take Finland on again, but it would be very painful. And Ukraine's already shown them that, boy, is this painful. I mean, in terms of the colossal losses that Russia has suffered in taking, you know, each increment of Ukrainian territory. So we have to be able to show to Russia that there's a lot to be lost, you know, by doing this again. And the question is, you know, is there more to be gained? And then to make sure that Ukraine can function, even if it doesn't have the capacity to completely function also, like Japan is an independent, or Finland is an independent, sovereign country.
My last question before opening the floor, there are a lot of students in the audience, obviously interested in international affairs, foreign policy. If you could give them one piece of advice for what skill, topic, area, discipline they should really focus on to be sort of, no one's future-proof, but future-ready, what would you advise them?
I'd always say area studies, actually, and multidisciplinary. So I could not be doing any of the things that I'm doing now or done any of the things I've done without honestly being here at the Davis Centre. And I'm not just saying that because I'm here, but I say that every time I am here because I got such a great grounding in the region. And I mean, I don't know what people think, you know, you do in area studies, just draw the area and colour it in, you know, but we're doing all the issues.
That's what we do now.
Yeah, I know, exactly. But, well, now with a lot of the funding disappeared, that's what
that's
we
all
might
that's
be doing.
left.
Let's draw another map of Moldova, shall we?
Yeah.
What colour should we be today? But it's basically, you get the full grounding in the whole gamut of issues. And you do need some economics, you know, you do need grounding in government, politics, and history and language as well. No, you will not be able to, you know, kind of grasp the full things that are happening through Google Translate and Duolingo. You should actually put in the effort to try to, you know, learn at least one of, you know, the kind of regional languages, because it does help you to figure out how people think. And, you know, I know that Steve Witkoff and others have just been winging it and thinking, who cares about whether you speak the language or not? Well, we've seen a lot being lost in translation, even to the point that Putin is frustrated that, you know, kind of he's not getting his message across and keeps repeating the same 1,000, you know, kind of year cycle of history. And you do need to know the context. And I would just say that you have to try to go out there and always understanding that you'll never know enough and be humble about that. And also just kind of figure out what are the questions that you need to keep asking. You may not always have the answers, and in fact, I'm still grasping for a lot of answers to questions. I started off trying to figure out, I've told this story before, my great uncle told me, go out and try to figure out why the bloody Russians are trying to blow us up. So that was in 1983, when it was the standoff of the Euro missile crisis, and everybody was watching Threads in the day after and contemplating the city of Sheffield in England being obliterated by a nuclear weapon. And chatting to an uncle, we should figure this out. So I'm still trying to figure that out. I haven't necessarily got to the answer, but it led to all kinds of other questions. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of what we always need to, and we always have to be trying to look for answers. And I also am still an optimist that we can change things for the better. So I don't think that this is the end of the story, getting back to where you started off before. I think this can change. I don't necessarily think that we have to be in a full-on, again, conflagration. There are ways out of this, but none of them are easy. And there's not one single solution. I just had a media call today where they're asking, well, if we put more on this sanctions, or we did more, or we did this, and I said, that it's not an either or an and, kind of question. It's really, this is tough. And it's, it couldn't be solved in 24 hours, and, maybe we've got a long way, still to go. But there are ways in which we push and we keep on pushing towards some kind of different outcome from where we are now.
Well, we've got a little more than a half hour left to solve it. So,
I bet there's some people in here with some good ideas as well.
I'm sure there are, and we can now hear from them. So the floor is now open. Craig, right in the middle.
There's a person with some good ideas.
Yeah.
Hi, Fiona.
Hey, Craig.
Hi, Craig Kennedy. I've got two questions. One concerns education and students. But first of all, cognitive dissonance coming out of Washington. You, of course, have focused a lot on some of the headline developments there. But for those of us who are looking closely at what is happening toward Russia out of Washington, the step up in sanctions back in October around oil was actually quite significant and hard-hitting. So it does suggest that there's more going on, perhaps underneath the surface, or is it a lack of unity of purpose within the administration? But I'd welcome your views on what's driving that harder line, at least in some branches of the government. Secondly, on students and area studies more broadly, one of the things that I've noticed coming back to more policy-related stuff after years in the business sector is that while we still have a lot of very competent economists who are looking at the big picture, we are lacking specialists who can look more deeply into the Russian economy and look specifically at sectors like the oil and gas sector, the banking sector. And as a consequence, because that's where all the damage is being done, we're overlooking much of the pain that they're suffering and not getting on top of it and being able to target ourselves more effectively. So what can we do to strengthen that muscle once more? I know the private sector is largely responsible for having hired away so many people from think tanks in the academy. And unfortunately, most have been reassigned to other parts of the world now.
Yeah.
But what can we do to build that capability back up?
Well, I'll start with the capability first, because I think it actually then reflects back onto the first part of your question, that we desperately need that. And I hope that there are young people in here who will think very seriously of pursuing kind of work on the Russian economy. I think that's the kind of the biggest one of the biggest questions to ask questions about and to look at now. My colleague at Brookings, who's now sadly retired, Cliff Gaddy, a very kind of famous student of the Russian economy, called, and again, don't walk out, Russia the cockroach of economies, because no matter what, it'll still be there and still be moving, and people always underestimate kind of its ability to keep on going. It's that kind of endurance and kind of adaptability of a kind of economy, and it's a huge economy, and just like the United States, you can do a lot of damage, but it still takes kind of a long while before any of that really kind of has an impact. And he meant that not pejoratively. He meant that actually in a rather admiring fashion, because he was always that stories that at the end of the world there'll still be cockroaches and rats and the animals that have adapted themselves to really difficult circumstances against all the odds. So there's... Yes, there's also that as well, which is, again, another adaptation at kind of, at certain, low levels. And we've seen over and over again that, Putin's, like I was saying before, has been able to adapt. I mean, a mercenary army now and paying contracts. We'd never have thought about that in a historical context. The test was also the Wagner and all these kind of paramilitary units proved successful. And after Prigozhin's insurgency and his, unfortunate fall from an aircraft and all the rest of it, the whole military is now operating on the same premise. So there's that adaptability, kind of again. And there's the scavenging aspect and, kind of shifting. But we've also seen, frankly, the Ukrainians doing the same thing. But obviously, with their own economy not being able to adapt in the same way because it's just they don't have the size and the scale and the energy resources which you've been looking at. So, I mean, I think what we need to do is to encourage more economists, but to work with others, with a kind of other context to take a look at this. Because you have to have that other broader context to really kind of understand, like you and others do about what you're really seeing here. And I would say that that's the next big set of questions, that people should be addressing about the future of Russia and the future, frankly, of Europe. Is about, how are we going to be dealing, with this over the longer term? What the Russian economy, the future of Russia. There's a book, an edited book out that Harley Balzer from previously Georgetown has done about, it's called Failure, I think, of Putin's failure, about looking at the kind of the ways in which the promise of what Putin, set out to do has failed for a variety of different reasons, or not, as the case may be. And one of the kind of questions is about, is it going to be possible now for Russia to demilitarize its economy in the future? Because when you've distorted things to such an extent and you've created this mass military production and everything is geared towards that, and it's kind of, Russia never really suffered, Cliff would always say this, from Dutch disease,
right,
that the energy sector actually subsidized the rest of the economy, not just pulled everything away from it, as happened in the Netherlands. But now the military industrial economy is pulling everything away from it, either sending people to the front, or it's become the biggest proportion now of the economy. And will it be easy to move away from that in the future? What happens to demobilized Russian soldiers? Everyone talks about Ukraine demobilizing and shrinking its military. What will Putin do, or would they do with all the people who've cycled through the front or have been grievously injured? Will they make the same amount of money that was made at the front in other jobs and in the economy? What will they be doing? This is the problem that every country has had to deal with at the end of war. Look what happened in Britain after World War I, or elsewhere. Why did the GI Bill? Why was that created in the US after World War II? It was to deal with all the people coming back from the front and expecting to have good jobs. And then you had social upheaval in Europe after World War I because you had mass unemployment and you went through the economic collapse, etc. And you had, as a result of that revolution, populist movements, all the rest of it. So there's all of these kind of questions about the implications that are there, and I don't have answers to them. But hopefully what we need to do is we need to set people on thinking about that. And that gets back to the first parts of your question, which I haven't really forgotten. You've got all kinds of people with different kind of ideas. And you've also got a president who gets annoyed with time to time that he's not making the progress he wants to. And so he's trying to, in a way, negotiate with Putin by, I can be really hard as well and I can do all these tough things. And there's other constituencies within the administration who do want to stick it still to Russia. Congress and the Senate, and there's still the people working or were working within Treasury and OFAC and elsewhere, and parts of business that don't particularly like the direction of travel. They're not all the ones who want to cash in on kind of the future bonanza of kind of doing business with Russia that keeps getting touted in all these kind of different articles, and they're given the green light to try these sanctions, and then kind of the president pulls back again. I mean, he did that the first administration as well, kind of going, right, I'm going to be Mr. Tough Guy now just to show them as part of the deal making, and then letting people rush out and do things, and actually they might actually have an effect. But then there's that inconsistency of then, well, no, I'm back to talking to him again. But doing the same with China, with tariffs, and now we're preparing
tariffs with everything.
Yeah, and now we're preparing, for Trump to go and visit Xi in Beijing. So there's kind of taking back more of the kind of harder lines on, China and dealing with the economy that everyone's noting as well. It's, Trump. From my perspective, it's a weird way of doing a deal. I mean, I wouldn't show my hand and basically do this, kind of on and off again. But look, it's obviously worked for him in the context in which he operated, and that's kind of the approach that he's taken to this as well.
Yes. No, right there. Yeah.
Hi, Fiona.
Hey,
Thank
Molly.
you. I want to ask you a question with your analyst hat on. The UK SDR talked about adversaries cooperating more. As you look at the Russia-China relationship, what do you project sort of over the next decade? Do you think Russia could accept being a junior partner as China only increases in terms of its global influence? Sort of any thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, it's a really great question, which I'm sure, again, people are thinking about a lot here. I mean, for those of us who've been, looking at the Russia-China relationship in the past, and, I've famously with Bobo Lowe, kind of my analyst colleague once wrote a paper talking about, the great likelihood that China and Russia would work very closely together, which goes to show that one should never be so, kind of clear.
Never write things down.
I know, we should never write things down because circumstances change. And that's really what has, circumstances at the time didn't look like they would change. So, which I think is, part an answer to your question. That necessity for China and Russia to be so close together could change in the future. It could, kind of well be that Russians will start to chafe under, what now looks like it's really emerging to be a very unequal relationship, a lot of dependency by Russia on China, where China is really calling the shots. There's been a lot of, articles and analysis on the fact that China's now, paying a lot less for Russian energy than, the Russians had hoped for, that Russia isn't getting always all the products that it wanted from China. And if
supplying
it does,
the key technology for drones as well.
Yeah. But it's also getting the prices jacked up, so over time there could be, some irritation there. And it will be kind of interesting if, Trump is trying to be friends with everybody, kind of befriend Xi as well as Putin, about whether that rationale for China and Russia to be so close gets somehow, diminished. Because what we couldn't have envisaged at the time when Bobo and I write this article, which is a long time ago now, we couldn't have quite imagined the circumstances in which Russia and China would feel that they had more to be gained from working really closely together than not. And you've heard Putin and others, talking about the necessity of being close together. But, one of the reasons that, Yeltsin wanted a peace treaty with Japan was because of concerns about China. And even though they signed the territorial agreements on the borders, Central Asian countries and Russia did, back in, it was about 2000 or just before 2000, there was a great deal of nervousness about what China would do in terms of claims about Russian territory across the border from China. I mean, the interesting thing is that Russia never had any claims against Ukrainian territory after the recognition of Ukraine as an independent country, but China's persisted in having overt, not just always covert, being perhaps not the official level, but certainly making it very clear, claims to the territory that was lost to the Russians after the various treaties in the 1860s. You go to China and you see all the maps, again, going back to colouring, where China's clearly colouring beyond the lines, into Russian
as they do in Kashmir.
Yeah. And so, you could always see that there was those kinds of tensions there. And if I think back to 2012, 2013, which is hard to think back again to now, when the Chinese launched their transpolar expeditions with the Snow Dragon, the nuclear-powered ship, the Russians started to beef up all the security there. And that's when they started beefing up the security again, the Kurils and Kamchatka. They appealed to the UN to have the Sea of Okhotsk declared as a Russian sea because they wanted to keep China out. And then since then, of course, they've been inviting China more into the Arctic and all kinds of things, but it's also to head off the United States. So what if now Trump is basically saying, but I'm best friends with all of you. I see the world in the same way. Will that, kind of then cause some pause for thought, somewhere in Moscow and also in Beijing? I don't know. But, I mean, basically the point of this is circumstances changed and circumstances can change again. And when Putin was asked about, why was it that he'd gone after Ukraine, he said circumstances changed. So I think that's a lesson, certainly a lesson in humility for me, is that the circumstance, the context in which we look at things change and change quite dramatically. And, you know, I think about Angela Stent's book about the limits of partnership. I was talking to Angela about this the other day. The limits of a partnership between Russia and the United States were because you couldn't imagine a US president thinking exactly the same way as Vladimir Putin. Well, now you can. So are there any limits to this partnership? So again, I think the answer is really in the way that the context might change. The Russians may feel less comfortable about drawing so close. And the Chinese may think at some point that maybe that close relationship isn't as useful. And with Xi and Putin, it's definitely personal. Those two generally seem to actually like each other and to have a relationship that might change as well.
In the back row there, he could have just called the Sea of Okhotsk the Sea of Russia. Now that's an option now.
I think they were starting to say that about the. Do you remember the Caspian Sea or the Black Sea? They were saying that they should change that. Sea of Russia. It's like everyone's going to change their seas. Yeah.
An unfair question. If indeed we're at war with, or Russia is at war with us without us really knowing it, what would you take as the sign that we've lost?
Oh.
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't think we've... Anyway, look, what is the outcome of all of this? What is the end point? I mean, I think Putin... did you see probably some of the... articles, kind of today in the interviews, Medvedev and others, delighted with the national security strategy and all the rest of it. I mean, I'm sure that they're telling the Europeans, you've lost, give up all hope, now we think alike, boy, you guys in trouble. And it's just that kind of sense that, you've got the kind of we used to talk about, the whole idea of everything kind of coming together. What was the term we used to use where everybody started to look like everything else? Convergence. Yes, thank you. I was thinking of something. I was thinking of Russian. I couldn't think of it in English for a moment there because I remember
That's
reading
a bit of a flex,
which
really.
Is weird. Yeah. No, but it was an article. I was thinking that someone had written a Russian about that whole idea. I couldn't think of the English word for a moment. We've converged, but not in the way that we thought. Right? It wasn't a kind of convergence of everybody coming through to the ideas of liberal democracy or free markets and all the rest of it. We've converged maybe back or reverted back as we look out to the ideas of spheres of influence and great powers deciding everything and smaller powers having, no say in anything. So in a way, there's been that loss of that perspective of the last 80 years that we've all been flourishing under and planning out our lives and our courses of study and everything else, of thinking that we were in a very different world. Now, many of you will have had the same conversations that I've had with Russian counterparts over the last several years, very cynically saying, well, that was all rubbish anyway. Nobody really believes this. You kind of liberal idiots, kind of in your, nice, cushy Western world, thinking these kinds of great thoughts when the world's not like that. You're just now reverting, back to type. But I would just sort of say for all of the countries, the countries in the world, and many of us, here came from some of those or represented them, our ancestors, families came. That's not a world that everyone thought that they were signing up to live in. And it's actually not the world that the Brazilians, the Indonesians, the South Africans, who've just been told they can't be in the G20 anymore, the Singaporeans, the Japanese, the South Koreans, everybody else think that they're in. I mean, everybody else thinks they're actually, in fact, they're in a multipolar world where, they don't want to be under blocks. They certainly don't want to be in a world that's carved up between and among three great powers, the Chinese, the Russians, and the United States. A lot of the rest of the world thinks of Russia actually as a spent force. And, despite the fact that we kind of frame it in these regards, I mean, we did a project. I was here last year talking to Jenny Albatz, and I think I might have mentioned that we'd done a series, Angela Stent and Dan Hamilton and a few other people at Brookings, did a series of discussions with counterparts at think tanks in other parts of the world, including in Brazil and South Africa and Korea. And they actually thought that the war in Ukraine, I think I might have mentioned this and some of you might have been here, was the first proxy war between the United States and China. It wasn't between Russia and the United States at all, because they thought that everything was really in this frame of China and Russia was no longer relevant. And Brazil thought about Russia only insofar as they got fertilizer from Russia. But they weren't thinking about Russia on a regular basis, and they wondered why we were all the time. And I had a conversation with the head of
the way
intelligence.
Putin thinks about Europe, though.
Yeah,
Putin
well, exactly.
thinks about Europe as
the head
sort
of
a
intelligence for Singapore, which was kind of interesting at the Munich Security Conference, is why people in Europe are so scared of Russia? And all the the Europeans went, well, they can't say. So, but there's so many of you, and if you put everything together, what's the problem? We're not scared of Russia. Well, and everyone said, well, you're a bit far away from it. I said, yeah, but the world has changed. The kind of world has moved on. Why are you obsessing about Russia all the time? And so that, for a lot of the rest of the world, they just would look at us and say, why are you still talking about all of this? And that gets back to, again, to your kind of question. It's just that we're all, maybe we have lost, because we've lost our minds, because we're living in this frame that is created by this whole idea that we're in this competition among the great powers, again, still of Russia, now the United States and China. We've lost our way in a world that we all thought we were moving towards, where we all got to be the deciders of our own destinies. And so, I think, again, we've got to start questioning whether that's really where we are, because Putin's saying that's where we are, and a lot of people, looking at realist, kind of critique of foreign policy and all the rest of it, would say, well, yes, Russia's this great power, and they have the right to a sphere of influence, and the US is now exerting its sphere of influence. So that's kind of where the rest of the world is. Well, whose sphere of influence is Indonesia and Brazil, and, well, the United States would say Brazil, but South Africa and all the other countries. Where is the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia? They're deciding a lot of questions in the world today. A lot of activities taking part in Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Are they in someone's sphere of influence? The Turks think they have a sphere of influence, kind of around them. Most of the rest of the world is not actually living in that frame that we have drawn up for ourselves. So we've lost our way, let's put it that way. And maybe we need to kind of be starting to debate about how things could look differently.
Down here, yes. There's a mic coming. We may be seeing domestic politics convergence too. My favorite line in your memoir is that Russia is the ghost of Christmas future for the United States.
Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, it didn't play out quite like good old Scrooge got wised up by woke up in the morning. We haven't woken up yet.
One obviously, the American support hitherto for Ukraine has been crucial in the overall balance, and part of the stakes of this are for those who are not for the Russians is discrediting Ukraine as an actor, because the Americans tend to moralize politics to a great extent.
Yeah.
And so the corruption issue.
Yeah.
I was struck by this morning's lead article on the Times, that the Times to a far greater extent than it has hitherto really focused on this, and you talked about the millions being made by Zelensky's friend, as it was actually sort of as if it was a planted article, although the allegations may be true. And I would welcome your comment as to how this is playing out or could play out.
It links to that question that we just asked about, how do we know when we've lost, kind of an... because I think that is part of the message at the moment, which is not to downplay it all by the corruption, by the way. I'm not going to do that, but it's the weaponization of that information about the corruption. And it's part of that whole idea that Ukraine is a lost cause. And not only are they losing on the battlefield, but they're, filching off all of this money, and, kind of we're losing out as a result of this. And that's certainly part of President Trump's view that the Americas are always being ripped off. And here we are, all the taxpayers, again, we're being ripped off by Europeans of all different persuasions, relying on our security all the time, where they go off and, do things. No, but I think that at the moment it is such a big story. But I was going to move on from that to say, however, that we've got a hell of a lot of corruption going on here at the moment as well. So let's just which is not always being written about, but is sometimes written about in certain contexts. So what's happened in Minnesota, where obviously, in the New York Times as well, I read an article about Minnesota, and of course we've heard all of Trump's terrible comments about Somalis, but there's definitely a huge corruption problem and fraud and abuse and waste, as they're kind of always talking about, in terms of COVID money in Minnesota. But it's being weaponized and instrumentalized. And if we think about Putin, and the book that Cliff Gaddy and I wrote, and then lots of people here have worked about that, is the way that Putin works, the operative in the Kremlin, with the idea of corruption. Often he encourages people to be corrupt. So that, kind of in the Russian context, pretty much everybody is corrupt, whether they like it or not. They've been lured into something that can be played back against them. But they don't always use it until the moment is right. And Putin's also very clear about that. Everybody around him is encouraged to, basically enrich themselves, kind of at the state. But at some time, when he might want to go after you, that becomes extremely relevant. So there's a Russian angle in this corruption in Ukraine. There's Dedkach, who featured in impeachment, number one, and all corruption. And there was Hunter Biden in all of those kind of tales in the first time around. All of that was being instrumentalized for U.S. politics purposes and for Ukrainian politics purposes. Obviously there is an instrumentalization of this, and someone has kind of been talking to reporters. It's a big story. But, it's not the only story. And so I think that we have to, kind of think about the timing of all of this, because the corruption was obviously there and, was being, maybe it's being exaggerated. Do we know the extent? But it's this weaponization, the instrumentalization of these issues. And as I said, we've got a lot of corruption going on here now in the United States as well. And that some of it's being selectively investigated. Others, people are frightened to investigate. We think about Alexei Navalny. What was Alexei Navalny doing all the time? He was always out there putting a spotlight on the corruption that was extensively about going on in Russia. And I would say, and I hate to say it, but let's just put it out there, there's a lot of corruption going on in this deal-making. Who are the people who are engaged in this? They're all talking. The Wall Street Journal has been writing a lot of articles recently, quite surprisingly so, about all the cast of characters involved in these deals behind the scenes, all of whom seem to be related to everybody else or went to school with everybody else, who are all looking to cash in on deals, not that dissimilar from what we're seeing in Ukraine. We've had plenty of stories of people paying people close to Trump for access to Trump, including some people who are still there, or other people being kicked out of the circle around him because he didn't like the fact that they're cashing in and making money on him. And I always keep thinking about, when I was here at Harvard, there was a student performance of Bertolt Brecht, the Mother, Courage and Her Children. It's all about war profiteering in the 30 Years' War in, what was later Czechoslovakia, I kind of guess at the time. And it's all about, war profiteer and a priest that, gets different religions every 5 minutes depending on which army's coming in. I think we're seeing exactly the same things over and over again. So we also have to, we can't diminish it, but I think we have to, like you're putting that question there, ask ourselves, getting back, to other questions, what's going on here? This is being instrumentalized and weaponized at this particular time. We have to address this corruption, but is it being used to, again, push this moment so that Ukraine seems to have lost, because it's lost the faith, it's lost the support, it's lost the even the right now to be supported because of this corruption. Well, a lot of countries then might forfeit the right for support given the levels of corruption. But I think that's a really valid question to be asking at this point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Adam Dixon, I'm wondering if you would agree that Ukraine is orders of magnitude less effective in the information war than Russia. And if you would also agree that much more of an effort needs to be made in this country to help the Ukraine towards a more level playing field. What little comes out is much too weak and very seldom gets the type of attention that it needs to in order to get circulation. Little bits come out recently. Stephen Moore had something addressed to evangelicals about the nature of Christianity within Ukraine and the degree of repression and arguably the Potemkin church in Russia that motivates onward Christian soldiers within the Russian context in a sort of Dugin Karaganov type mold.
Yeah, I mean, this is another, kind of related point, getting back to what you're saying about why is the New York Times looking at this particular issue right now and not at other, issues, or why about what was going on in... Yeah, I mean, anyway, all of these things are, they're obviously worthy of scrutiny, but it does start to raise kind of questions about that larger information war that I was mentioning before. Because, I do think Ukraine is losing in the information war. Maybe we're all losing out in that as well, because again, what I said before, we're just awash with this at all times. And we're not having the kind of national conversation, that we should be here in the US or even in Europe as well about these issues. Because of what's happening on our domestic fronts as well. I mean, just to be honest about it. I mean, we're living in, kind of our own sea in the domestic politics of polarization, fragmentation, misinformation, deliberate, disinformation, weaponization of information at all times. I mean, one of the reasons, frankly, why the administration and President Trump has been taking down the Voice of America and going after Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberties, because they don't want to have the same debates at home. So unfortunately, getting back to have we lost, we're losing the ability to have serious conversations about the issues that we need to. It's not just Ukraine, it's about a whole host of other issues. And we need to have these debates. And so if we're thinking about, back to some of the questions about what can we do on the Russian economy, what can we do on these other issues, we need to have debates like this. And this is perhaps not a debate, but we need to have conversations in which many of us are getting together to talk about this and to figure out about going around and talking to people about these very issues. Actually, if you look at a lot of the polling that's been done by Pew, Common Ground's done quite a bit. I've got a colleague, Shibli Telhami at Brookings, is also at the University of Maryland, who does strategic polling. You'll see that there is a lot of support still for Ukraine in the United States. Not that people think that American soldiers should be on the ground fighting for Ukraine. In fact, Ukrainians have not asked us for that, but that we should be supporting Ukraine to fend off Russia, even if we're not going there to help them reclaim their territories, but to fend them off, to be able to make that stand so that they're not going to be completely taken over. It's something like 68% of Americans still feel like that. So, in that respect, yes, kind of maybe the Ukrainians are not getting the treatment that they, ought to be and deserve to be getting, but that people are at some level understanding that what's happening to them really isn't fair, and that it's not the usual American position to be kicking the underdog all the time, when they're down. And it's also, despite the fact that Putin often seems to be winning the propaganda war, only something like 4 or 5% of Americans kind of think that he's doing the right thing or that he's the guy. That's not a winning percentage. I mean, he's doing a lot better in his own context, but I think people have got his number and are realizing that he may be a great president for Russia, or the context in which he's presenting himself, but he's not somebody that people, kind of in the American context anyway, see as, being somebody who should be supported. Now, it's a bit complicated, more complicated in Europe and, in different segments of the population where people kind of see, Putin as the kind of great, literally white hope of, civilization and humanity. And there are people, somewhat considerable percentages in Slovakia and Hungary and, parts of East Germany. But, kind of more generally, I think here in the United States,
he's a known.
The president, some of the people around him are in a somewhat different place from the majority of Americans.
So we are about at time, with apologies to those who had their hand up. I just wanted to close us off, I just want to ask you, what is the one book that you would recommend, or article, do people still read books? What is the one book that you would recommend to people in this room to read to really be better informed about this world into which we are now moving?
Ouch.
Yeah.
Yeah. Into the world into which we're moving.
Or, yeah.
Oh God, I hate this
I mean,
question.
to be ready to better handle 2026 and 2027, which is just around the corner. What's the one book you would recommend people read?
Alice Through the Looking Glass.
Written by a Durham professor, yes?
That's right. No,
Yeah.
well, obviously we had to link to it. No, so the first time around, I think, I actually thought that Alice in Wonderland was my best preparation for, kind of ending up at the, the court of the Red Queen, or the kind of Queen of Hearts, off with their heads and, kind of all kinds of, crazy, because it's really happening. Why have I grown so much? Why have I shrunk? Following the right rabbit down conspiracy, things of, rabbit holes. But this time around, if Alice in Wonderland was a fantastic, amazing book, and brought so much to the English language, like rabbit holes and all the rest of it, the kind of quick expression we wouldn't have had. And Lewis Carroll didn't do quite so well with Alice Through the Looking Glass, the second book. And I went back and read it recently. I could see why. But it brought us the Jabberwocky, the kind of the greatest nonsense poem in the English language. It brought us Tweedledum and Tweedledee. If you look at Tweedledum and Tweedledee, it's got a lot of, thinking that might make you think about some things that are kind of happening at the moment. But the one big thing about it's a chess game that kind of runs through. And to go forward, you have to go backwards. So that's why I suddenly thought about it, because, the Queen is always running really fast. Once she gets through the looking glass, you just can't figure out her way forward to kind of, basically get through this massive game of chess. And it's all kinds of strange knights and all kinds of crazy people. It's a kind of a war game. But you're always going backwards to get forward and going back at great speed. And I feel at the moment like we're going back at great speed, and yet we're still going forward. I feel like sometimes I've got trapped in the 18th century. The constant partitions of Poland. Or I'm in the 19th century, and, kind of we're talking about the concert of Europe again, and Metternich, but without Metternich. And it's just like, it's head spinning. Wow. And there's all those kind of elements, and we're just in a really weird meta frame at the moment. But Alice eventually gets out. So I hope we'll get out as well.
Fabulous. It's on my Christmas reading list. Thank you, Fiona, for joining us.